Dr. Gina Riley is an educational psychologist, clinical professor, and program leader of the Adolescent Special Education Program at City University of New York, Hunter College. She has over 15 years experience working with teens diagnosed with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disorders. She is also widely published in the fields of special education psychology, school psychology, and mental health counseling. My listeners may know Gina most for her internationally renowned work in the fields of homeschooling, unschooling, and self directed learning. She has authored numerous academic journal articles on unschooling and self directed education, as well as co authored many others with Boston College psychology professor Peter Gray. Gina is the author of the 2021 book, The Homeschooling Starter Guide: How to Create and Adapt the Best Education Action Plan for Your Needs. Gina Riley, welcome to the Liberated Podcast.
Thank you so much. So excited to be here, Carrie.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you here. I'm such a big fan, and obviously, I devour all of your research and just love the work that you do, especially in the area of alternative education, unschooling, self-directed learning. So, I want to spend most of our time today talking about that, and I'd love to start with how did you first discover the world of alternative education, and kind of begin your journey down that path?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I always come to this work from the lens of intrinsic motivation. I was a young single mom. I was automatically kind of interested in educational alternatives. And then I did my bachelor's with my son. He was 3 when I graduated. And then I did my master's, and I was looking for a thesis topic, right? I remember reading a New York Times article on Edward D.C. and Richard Ryan's work of self-determination theory and intrinsic motivation. This was in like 1999. And I immediately was like, yes, like this is how I want to live my life. This is how I'd love for my son to be able to live his life, right, in a very self-directed, intrinsically motivated way. So my actual first publication on homeschooling was that master's thesis. It was an ethnographic study of homeschoolers and intrinsic motivation. And then my research and writing sort of led from there. I do teach at a traditional school of education. I educate New York City school teachers, special education teachers. I absolutely love what I do. It is very different. So I'm looking at the world of self-directed education from 2 different lenses.
Yeah, so I love that you came to this more from, both, I guess, a personal and an academic journey, but you chose to unschool your now grown son. So what was that like for you? Again, as you're kind of in between these two worlds and looking at this from a personal and professional perspective, what was that like over the years?
If I could take time back, right? That was like the best time in my whole life. There will never be another time like it. I really, again, as a working student, single mother, got to witness the learning journey of my son, who unschooled from birth to first day of college. And is now 27. He is a music educator as well as an editor in a major publishing company of medical journals. So like, who knew, right? But this journey has taken me places that are incredible. The lens through which I saw his childhood and his adolescence is a lens that I use frequently in my work with traditional educators. Really, it was the best time in my life. I feel so privileged to have done it. I don't know how I did it, working and
Right.
and going to school and being a single mother, but it worked out. It was fine, right? And yeah, now he's a full-grown, amazing adult.
Amazing. Yeah. And like you said, charting this sort of interesting self-driven course. And again, who knows what else he'll do in the rest of his life, because he has that personal agency and that sense of self-determination that can enable him to follow his interests. And so as you were raising your son as an unschooling working mom, you also were writing a lot about unschooling and the philosophy of self-directed education, not only domestically here in the US, but you wrote about unschooling in Hong Kong and other places around the world. Tell us what unschooling means to you.
Yeah, so unschooling to me is the most intrinsically motivated form of education. It's the most intrinsically self-directed form of learning. It is learning without barriers or borders. It is learning without curriculum, without a focus on testing and assessment. And it's learning through everyday life. And I think that's where the real joy comes in. Of course, nothing is without its challenges or struggles, but unschooling really truly is the most intrinsically motivated form of learning out there.
And as I mentioned in your intro, you've published many academic journal articles about unschooling and self-directed education. You've also teamed up with Dr. Peter Gray, who's another self-directed education advocate, to co-author various papers, including one study that you did on grown unschoolers. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those general findings.
Sure. I mean, I think it's important, first of all, to know that the heart of my work has always been to legitimatize this movement, right? I know that when I was unschooling my son, there were so many people around me who had doubts. There were so many people who questioned and almost scarily questioned why I was choosing this most untraditional form of education for my son. And so when I do my research, the heart of my research is definitely as this person who's saying, okay, here's a form of education. Let's study it. Let's see what happens. So the basis to the young adult unschooler study is in 2013, Peter Gray and I had published the 232 unschooling family study. And that was the largest study of unschooling families. And, the benefits were so many. Of course, you had the freedom of family schedule, you had intrinsically motivated learning. And we really actually wanted to know if like the parents and families of these kids we had filled out a questionnaire were actually telling the truth, right? So the impetus of that study was really to see what unschooled adults thought about their learning experience. We not only wanted to know what they thought about the learning experience then, but also what they were now doing in terms of career and college. And so that part of it was so important. Really, we just wanted to see if those findings that we found, was it all like all the benefits, were they there? Did the kids feel it? And as grown adults, the kids really did feel it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what was really incredible about that study is that, these adults who had been unschooled were living fulfilling adult lives. They had a variety of different, career choices. And one of the things that I took away from that study was that more than half of the grown unschoolers were working as entrepreneurs in fields connected to interests that they developed in childhood and adolescence. So given that freedom and that autonomy and that agency, they were able to really pursue their own passions in an entrepreneurial way, which I think is just so fascinating. So
Yeah.
those were unschoolers, Gina, which I think you defined and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the study were people who were homeschooled using that self-directed educational approach to homeschooling that we would consider unschooling. They weren't necessarily people who were enrolled in a democratic school or a Sudbury model school, which is also very much among that same philosophy of educational freedom and self-directed learning and unschooling. But you also have done some research on the latter, on students who've been educated in democratic schools or Sudbury model schools modeled after the original Sudbury Valley School, including a more recent research article that you, Peter Gray, and another academic, Kevin Curry Knight, published looking at alumni of the Hudson Valley Sudbury School. And what did you find in terms of those results, and how did they relate to perhaps the results of the alumni survey that you did on unschoolers?
Yeah. So of course, when we went to Hudson Valley Sudbury School, that research was done during the pandemic, right? It was so interesting. We had, come up with the idea prior, and then it took 3 years for that research really to grow. The benefits were very similar, right? You had that freedom of schedule, freedom to do and explore strengths and talents. You, of course, had that intrinsic motivation and self-determination line. What was really interesting about the democratic school study was that kids saw their peers as really, really important and essential to the learning that they were doing in that school. They saw their peers as, as if not more essential than the facilitators who work at Hudson Valley Sudbury School, who are wonderful, amazing people. But the peer learning was incredible. They found their peer learning, like not only just how to do stuff, but also when we think about things like morals and character, they really sought out advice from their peers. They looked to their peers as models. That study was such an interesting study because of that, right? We often don't talk about the importance of peers in learning in any sort of way, whether it be traditional schools or unschooling or homeschooling. But within Hudson Valley Sudbury School, that was the first thing that came up. Also, in terms of the challenges are always the same in these more alternative forms of learning. It's always about what other people think, whether it be friends or neighbors or internal family, of the decision to make an alternative educational choice. So I always think that's interesting as well.
Mm, that is interesting. So, you've been doing this for a long time, not only unschooling your own son for a long time, who's now, as you said, 27, but also then looking at alternative education, specifically unschooling and democratic schooling for quite a while. Have you seen a greater interest in this model, greater acceptance? I mean, how have those views of alternative education generally and self-directed education and unschooling specifically changed from your perspective?
Yeah, it was really interesting. In 1999, when you unschooled, you didn't say you unschooled, right? It wasn't even a term then. You just like sort of, said you homeschooled and went to homeschooling groups and realized that people were pretty much doing the same thing you were, which was just learning through life and play and all of that. Um, the pandemic really changed things. Suddenly, everyone was unschooling in those 2 weeks in March when we all were home, right? No one had any form of schooling because schools hadn't even started up their online education section. So, that was a very interesting time. Unschooling got some press, it got some publicity in the Boston Globe and the New York Times. And then all of a sudden, people were talking about unschooling. You had this whole pandemic pod phenomena, you had microschooling, and people were really talking about educational alternatives. It was happening a little bit prior to the pandemic, but in a huge way during the pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic, when people are really seeing the role of school, but also the role of learning outside of school. So yeah, the pandemic was an awful time for so many, but it certainly called or gave a call to educational options and changes.
And do you think that some of that greater openness toward alternative education might be due in part to sort of the increasing standardization of traditional schooling? I mean, we have more testing in schools over the past couple of decades, more rigidity in some ways in the traditional schooling sector. Is that driving some of this, or what do you think are some of the key motivators?
I mean, I think somewhat, right? Traditional school will always have a place in society, in my opinion, because there is not everyone who can homeschool, unschool, or afford an educational option. And so that's why public schooling is really important to me personally, right? But I will say that once you saw that you as a family could exist without a public school or private school structure, all of these sort of options became available. I'm getting more and more calls from parents really interested in things like pandemic pods or micro schools or unschooling and homeschooling. So I think it just like led a more acceptable entrance way. Everyone knows what homeschooling now is because everyone has done it now at some point in their academic career. And that really, it's interesting how societal changes really open up the conversation. Of course, there is rigidity in public schooling, and that's because you are schooling like a mass, right? It's a game of pure numbers. And I'm hoping that even our public education leaders, that our public education sector will see and can learn from those alternative models. I'm also always hoping that everyone, public school, homeschool, unschool, goes to a more intrinsically motivated way of learning, focuses on learning that's more generalizable. I think people are really seeing the benefit of intrinsically motivated generalizable learning and want that for their families.
Gina, I think back to John Holt, who, of course, coined the term unschooling in 1977 and was one of the early pioneers for more self-directed education and homeschooling. And I remember that at the time, sort of the 1960s, he was invited to be a guest lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education on radical pedagogy and was talking about, sort of alternative education and unschooling at the time. Have you seen any interest, especially in recent years, in the higher education space toward alternative education? Are you able to sort of inject any of your, research and findings into the classes that you're teaching when you're training, as you said, future New York City public school teachers and so on? How is this and is it moving into teacher colleges?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Probably not as fast as I individually would like, although my College of Education has been extremely supportive of my work, so very supportive, and so very supportive of the conversation surrounding alternatives in education. I will always be thankful for that. I will say that when I teach, right, I'm always teaching from the lens of intrinsic motivation and not unschooling or educational alternatives, because it doesn't serve my teachers who work in a very traditional system, right? And when you're working in systems, you have to learn to work within those systems. Although we do always talk about, right, things like generalization and learning, how to get kids to love learning more, how that entrance way happens. So do I see colleges, schools of education running toward this topic? Maybe not. I mean, I think the Harvard Homeschooling Conference has been wonderful in sort of getting the conversation moving, right? I think that there are a lot of people very interested in sort of putting their toes in the water with regards to what all this means. I think it's a good sign that more colleges are more open to online, hybrid, and high flex education and seeing how that works in the higher ed system, and maybe moving to how that works in the P-12 system. So we'll see. I think we're just dipping our toes in, but I'm hopefully hoping for more, because the more colleges get interested in this, it benefits students, but it also benefits in terms of research funding, and it benefits in terms of getting the word out there about educational alternatives as a valid, legitimate form of learning.
So Gina, you are an educational psychologist. Some of your research focuses around students who have emotional and behavioral disorders. You also work on mental health counseling. And of course, there is such heartbreaking data, particularly over the past decade, of declining youth mental health and a youth mental health crisis. What is your sense of that trend? What have you seen?
I mean, I think the response to the trend from public schools and districts has been to focus more on social emotional learning, which is really, we have to focus more on social emotional learning and mental health and advisory in schools. Is it the only way to go? No. I hope social emotional learning doesn't become this code word, right? Or this trendy school term. I hope we really do pay attention to children's and teens' thoughts and feelings and emotions. And so my hope is that those social emotional learning programs that are happening do that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I always find fascinating are, and this is more anecdotal, but I'd love for there to be more academic research around this too, are the other students who are struggling emotionally or behaviorally in a conventional school system, and then they leave for homeschooling, unschooling, other kinds of alternative education, and those issues and challenges, if they don't disappear, they become often less severe when they're given more freedom and autonomy outside of the conventional school system. Have you been able to find any data around that, or have been able to see any kind of trends in that way?
I wish I could quote data, right? Because that's where I go. I'm most likely an unbiased researcher in this. I will say that there is more focus on or thought going into freedom, autonomy, and decision making. A lot of people sometimes struggle to see the thread between all my work. I do work with supported decision making, which is an alternative to guardianship in New York State. I do work on high flex education, which is hybrid flexible, online, in person at the same time. And I do work, of course, on homeschooling and unschooling. And everyone's like, well, where's the thread, right, that ties all these together? And I'm always like, yeah, the thread lies in freedom and autonomy.
Yes.
And so when people leave school for whatever reason, they're generally looking for more freedom, more autonomy in their lives, and therefore most likely more control of self, right? Or more learning about self. And so I always think that, I never want anyone to be unhappy in a place that they're in. And so if leaving school for another educational alternative makes a student happier, especially a student teen and preteen, where they can do things more independently, then I hope that's helpful to them. I do know that the future is very open. I think everyone thinks that there is one path, that there's one path to graduating from high school, that there's one path to college. And there really isn't. I've been working in colleges and universities for like 27 years now, right? There really isn't one path to get into anything. There are always several ways. And so I hope that's not a hindrance. And I also hope more students do see that as a path, a prospective path.
Yeah. So maybe a future of wider variety of options and lots of pathways to adulthood, and a greater acceptance of that. I love your focus on freedom and autonomy as the common thread in your work, and certainly something I care a lot about too in terms of educational freedom. So you wrote the book, The Homeschooling Starter Guide: How to Create and Adapt the Best Education Action Plan for Your Needs. It came out in 2021. Was that prompted by the education disruption caused by COVID, or had this been in the works? And what was sort of the origin story to writing that book?
Yeah, so no, this had been in the works. I was writing that just after I finished Unschooling, Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom, which is the academic first book on unschooling. So Homeschooling Starter Guide came into play. A publisher said, hey, like we were really interested in this rise in homeschooling. This is prior to the pandemic. Can you write something about it? I swear my books were like just good timing, right? It wasn't like it just came out and it was like, oh. And I loved writing the Homeschooling Starter Guide because it was, not everyone is ready to unschool. Not everyone is ready to jump from a pool of like, here I am traditionally educated and go into like, okay, here I am so self-directed. And homeschooling is a great sort of medium, right? Because people like to hold on to what they know, right? And if we could do school at home at first, that feels very comforting. And so, yeah, I started writing the Homeschool Starter Guide. I had a lot of liberty in writing that, which I loved. So I could explore all these educational philosophies with people. We could talk about budgets and homeschooling with people. We could talk about lesson planning if that was what they were interested in, or how they wanted their lesson plans or reporting to look. We could talk about the path to college and adulthood. So that, was a really important book just in terms of getting people to get to know what homeschooling is, to make it less scary, and to kind of ease them into a path that might not be familiar to them. So I love that book. It's a great book. It also has a really great explanation of all these cool educational philosophies. So that's my favorite part.
And so, of course, it came out in 2021, where we saw more than doubling of the whole U.S. homeschooling population in those first years of COVID. What was your take on that? Were you getting additional inquiries from people? I guess how did the book do kind of at that moment where homeschooling was really top of mind for everyone?
Yeah, it was so nice. I mean, it's not like I'm making so much money from this book, right? Like I have my job. It's never been, right. My focus has always been my job and doing the best I can here. But it was a really nice way to get the word out about homeschooling. It was one of those things my 21-year-old self would have been super proud of, right? Like here you are homeschooling, you feel like you don't know what you're doing, and here you are 20 years later, writing a book about it. So
Oh,
how cool is that?
yeah.
All of my writing is probably more intrinsically motivated than anything. I'm not looking for like the super big sell. I'm not looking for like anything like that, but I am always looking to help and assist people in making choices that may be outside their comfort zone. And I hope I've done that. I also hope like I've given people courage and bravery, especially people who are not in white two-parent families, that they can do this, that they can homeschool at any budget, at any level. That's really important to me too, the equity and accessibility factor that comes in when talking about homeschooling and unschooling.
So let's talk a bit more about that then, Gina, because one of the stereotypes of homeschooling that lingers today is that, right, you do need sort of a two-parent household, one stay-at-home parent. You, of course, smashed that stereotype as a single working mom who was also homeschooling. So what do you say to a parent who maybe was in your shoes when you were 21, right? A single parent who wants to homeschool and needs to work. How do they do it?
Yeah, I always say you follow the dream or the goal, right? So if the goal was to homeschool, my goal was to just do anything that allowed me to do that. Online learning wasn't big then. I did my graduate degrees online and the only place I could, because that was what was available for me to be able to be home. I also looked for remote online work during that time. So I was teaching online in colleges in 1999 when no one had ever heard of it, right? And that definitely served me well later on. But I think that the sole goal was just to spend as much time with this amazing human as I could possibly spend. And the other stuff just sort of made sense. So remote work, remote school. There are lots of ways to make money, to gain an education, to do everything you want in this lifetime. You just have to seek it out. And I think that's important. It doesn't take that much effort either, right? Everyone thinks it's like a huge thing. No, I mean, if you really want this lifestyle for your child, for you and your child, you can certainly seek out alternatives. People have also been amazing to me in my life. And I always love like the free museum days, the free zoo days, right? Libraries have been an incredible resource. People have been very kind in sharing their talents and strengths with my child, who now takes those talents and strengths and uses them. So, I think that there's so many ways to do things. And I don't think we have to be stuck in this one like path that you go to work away from home or that you go to school away from home. You can have it all. It's just a matter of the balance.
Well, and I wonder if it's easier to some extent now than it was in 1999 for a lot of reasons, not only the online
Um,
learning piece and the abundance of information at our fingertips, but also there's just so many, because there's so many more homeschoolers, there's so many more options for homeschoolers. Obviously, we've seen this growth in micro schools. There's self-directed learning centers where you could have your child go part-time or full-time. There's just so many more schooling alternatives that make make the choice to homeschool more of an option for more families. So that's also exciting to see. And I wonder, what is your sense of the future of alternative education, right? We've seen this momentum build over the past few years. Of course, it was building pre-2020, but now it's really skyrocketed. What is your sense of alternative education and unschooling, say, over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think I never would think I'd ever say this, but I actually think we're going to see tremendous growth. I think the conversation has started. People are talking about the challenges inherent in traditional education and also the alternatives. And that alternatives conversation was never in mainstream media. It was never anywhere like that. And now I think we finally landed at a place where we can have educated conversations, where we can share different viewpoints and really be accepted and embraced as educational innovators. And I think that, hopefully our society is just going more toward that, more toward the innovation, more toward changing what we have. And I think culture does have to follow, right? You can't have a change in an educational system without a change in culture.
I think that's right. And I think it's big too. I think we're just at the beginning of this tremendous growth and innovation, as you say. So, Gina, what is on deck for you in terms of the research you're currently working on or future research, particularly in the area of alternative education and unschooling and democratic schooling?
Yeah, so I'm super excited. I've done a lot of work on kids unschooling with disabilities. And so there will be an article coming out most likely this summer in the Journal of Unschooling and Alternative Learning about unschooling students with disabilities. And hoping that that conversation also opens up homeschooling and unschooling to a lot of individuals where it traditionally has not, right? Like we don't talk about unschooling and special education a lot. And so I'm really combining my two loves there and putting it both into research and more presentations about that. So that is on the horizon. I also have a book coming out on unschooling and intrinsic motivation. So using self-determination theory as a basis. So super excited about that.
Oh, I can't wait to read both of those. How can my listeners and viewers follow your work, Gina, connect with you, keep track of the new research that's coming out?
Sure. I'm such an academic, so I'm not so focused on social media. But on Twitter, I'm Professor G Riley, Riley. On Instagram, I'm the Unschooled Professor. You can find me on Facebook and then also on ResearchGate, of course, and that's where all my research is housed.
Gina Riley, thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thank you so much, Carrie. It's been such a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.